When most people picture Alaska, they imagine endless frozen wilderness, majestic mountains, and untamed frontiers. But the reality is far more complicated and far more shocking. Vast stretches of this massive territory are not just empty. They are tightly controlled, mysteriously restricted, and increasingly off-limits to ordinary residents and visitors alike. What forces dictate who can live, work, or even pass through these regions? Beneath the ice and snow lies a story of strategic power, environmental extremes, and human endurance that challenges everything we think we know about the last frontier. The Great Alaskan Frontier Myth. You would naturally assume anyone looking at a map of Alaska sees a limitless expanse of untamed wilderness, a completely blank canvas spanning 665,384 square miles. We are looking at a landmass that easily swallows up nearly 20% of the entire contiguous United States, stretching out to 2.5 times the sheer mass of Texas and over 4 times the size of California. Consider the absolute enormity of a geographical fortress containing 17 of the 20 highest peaks in the country, crowned by the towering 20,237-foot summit of Denali. Imagine a territory hoarding 3 million natural lakes and an estimated 100,000 ancient glaciers, which actually represents half of the total global supply. Yet, anyone peeling back the layers of the official census data for the years 2025 and 2026 will discover a deeply jarring reality. Can you comprehend that less than 1/20% of this staggering continental expanse is actually settled by human beings? Observing a state with so much available Earth remaining essentially empty is deeply unsettling. The narrative of boundless Alaskan expansion is simply an elaborate illusion. Out of the roughly 738,737 people who call this territory home, the vast majority are aggressively clustered into just 3 primary urban hubs, those being Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. The Anchorage and Matanuska-Susitna region alone absorbs over 406,633 residents, essentially hoarding the human capital and leaving the rest of the colossal state with an almost chilling density of just a single person per square mile. You have this sweeping terrain that suggests endless opportunity, but reality forces people into incredibly tight pockets of civilization. This intense concentration creates a stark divide in how basic survival is managed between the core infrastructure corridor, known as the Rail Belt, and the intensely isolated rural regions called the Bush. The deeper numbers reveal a, quote, population that is slowly draining away. The year 2025 cemented a grim milestone by marking the 13th consecutive year of negative net migration, the longest unbroken streak of outward movement since the end of the Second World War. During that period alone, 1,740 more individuals packed up and abandoned the territory than bothered to arrive. The internal composition of those who remain is undergoing a radical and troubling shift. The youth in historically indigenous western regions like the Kusilvak census area, where the median age sits at 24.6, are increasingly leaving to seek opportunities in the lower 48 states. Meanwhile, the population of residents aged 65 and older has spiked by over 3.2% in a single year, pushing remote southeastern communities like Haines to a median age approaching 50.8. We are looking at a looming workforce crisis that threatens the very foundation of major industries and regional stability across the PRO's entire territory. The extreme geographical isolation and the relentless outward migration pattern strictly dictate exactly who gets to survive and thrive in this intensely demanding environment. Young people look at the staggering costs of staying, the severe logistical hurdles, and the stark physical barriers, and they make the logical choice to depart for easier landscapes. The true Alaskan story is therefore strictly not found in the completely frozen, empty wilderness you see on television, but instead in the intensely packed urban centers and the rapidly aging, shrinking rural outposts. The majestic, Untamed frontier remains a profoundly powerful concept in our cultural imagination, but the harsh demographic reality paints a vastly different picture of a localized population tightly clustered together, holding on desperately against the incredible vastness, while the vital energy of their youth slowly slips away. The sinking foundation of Alaska. Now consider the earth beneath their feet. You would assume a geopolitical titan of this magnitude would naturally possess a sprawling transit web connecting its vital centers. The reality is shockingly inadequate. The entire state of Alaska possesses a mere 17,000 miles of roads. That is a laughable 0.4% of the entire national network in the United States. They are fighting a relentless battle against the sheer tyranny of distance, compounded by an actively crumbling geological foundation. 85% of this colossal landmass sits directly on permafrost. As the Arctic region warms at an alarming rate of nearly 4 times the global average, the structural ice bonding that holds the Earth together simply vanishes. The ground literally caves in, causing profound bearing capacity loss and massive ground subsidence. Entire roads and buildings shift, crack, and ultimately fail. Many engineers are now completely overwhelmed by the rapidly accelerating pace of these massive structural collapses happening across the entire state. But here is where the official historical and geographical records fail us completely. A groundbreaking 2025 study utilizing high-resolution satellite imagery and deep machine learning, known as Habitat, revealed a massive blind spot. Nearly 47% of all Alaskan infrastructure was entirely missing from previous OpenStreetMap records. Almost half the entire physical footprint of the state was simply erased or totally ignored by the official cartographers. When you finally account for all those hidden structures and phantom roads, the projected damage from thawing permafrost absolutely skyrockets. Under high-emission scenarios, we are looking at $51 billion in infrastructural damage by the year 2050. It is a slow-moving catastrophe that is effectively bankrupting highly isolated indigenous regions like the Yukon-Koyukuk area, hitting those completely remote interior settlements with devastating $1.8 million per capita damages. The federal government does not even officially recognize permafrost thaw as a natural hazard, leaving these forgotten communities to literally sink without any typical disaster relief funding. Look at the capital city of Juneau. It remains a bizarre case study in extreme isolation, standing as the only state capital in the country totally severed from the continental road system. It relies entirely on the Alaska Marine Highway System and regional airlines to move both people and basic goods. The state has frantically revived the Chilkat Connector study, proposing a route along the west side of Lynn Canal to finally link the capital to the outside world. Proponents demand a reliable supply chain, while residents in nearby Haines fight back bitterly, pointing to the 58 active avalanche chutes threatening the proposed path and fearing an industrial invasion of their pristine subsistence lands. Meanwhile, that vital coastal lifeline is operating on borrowed time. The Marine Highway serves 35 coastal communities, but it is crippled by an aging fleet where vessels average 36 years old, with some ancient ships pushing 60. This incredibly frail aging infrastructure simply cannot withstand another severe Arctic winter. The state is desperately scrambling to enact a new 20-year modernization plan, hoping to somehow finance fleet renewal and stabilize their workforce before ancient, deteriorating relics like the vessel Tustumena completely fail and plunge these heavily isolated coastal towns into total darkness and economic ruin. The ultimate strategic high ground. To truly grasp why the federal government fiercely guards this crumbling, freezing fortress, you have to look past the permafrost and dig directly into the blood and strategic calculus baked into its deep history. Long before modern nations began drawing borders on maps, this territory was the original gateway to the Americas. Over 36,000 years ago, distinct human populations crossed a massive land bridge known as Beringia, stepping out of Eurasia to establish ancient, incredibly complex societies in a landscape that would eventually become Alaska. These highly adaptable and resilient people thoroughly mastered an unbelievably harsh environment, building thriving cultures that sustain themselves in perfect balance with the extreme conditions for tens of thousands of years. That ancient balance was shattered violently and permanently in the mid-18th century. The arrival of Vitus Bering and his Russian expedition in 1741 triggered an apocalyptic demographic collapse across the native populations. European contact unleashed a devastating tidal wave of disease, bringing unseen enemies like smallpox, measles, and influenza to communities utterly lacking prior immunity. The sheer scale of the historical devastation is profoundly difficult for modern observers to truly and fully comprehend. Between the devastating smallpox epidemic culminating around 1840 and the unrelenting colonial violence, an estimated 80 to 95% of the entire native population perished. It was an absolute and catastrophic erasure of deeply established civilizations, leaving a severely depopulated landscape ripe for imperial claiming. This leads directly to one of the most misunderstood real estate transactions in human history. In 1867, the United States purchased this massive, grieving territory from Russia for a mere $7.2 million. Critics at the time relentlessly mocked the acquisition, derisively labeling the deal Seward's folly. They genuinely believed the Secretary of State had lost his mind by draining the treasury to buy a completely empty, frozen wasteland. What those short-sighted politicians failed to realize was that they had just acquired the ultimate strategic high ground on the planet. By expanding the national landmass by 23%, the country secretly secured an unparalleled defensive vantage point overlooking the entire northern hemisphere. That frozen wasteland operates as the heavily militarized front line of a very quiet, very real modern standoff. Alaska is now recognized by defense experts as the Golden Dome of global security. It stands as the absolute primary shield protecting the American homeland from catastrophic threats. Deep in the interior, installations like Fort Greely and the Clear Space Force Station house the highly specialized 49th Missile Defense Battalion. These soldiers operate a vast network of ground-based interceptors, because any intercontinental ballistic missile launched from hostile nations in Asia or Eastern Europe must arc directly over the Arctic region to reach the continental United States. Alaska provides the only geographical location capable of intercepting and destroying those threats mid-course. The federal government clearly knows exactly how incredibly critical this strategic defensive position truly is today. The fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act just poured massive amounts of funding into reinforcing this Arctic shield, specifically directing $292 million toward Alaskan bases. This aggressive military construction includes $82 million dedicated solely to the Jaber Integrated Test Center, ensuring the military stays ahead of evolving hypersonic and cruise missile technologies. They are continually upgrading critical early warning systems like the Cobra Dane radar facility out on the remote edge of Shemya Island. The territory is no longer just a remote wilderness, but an actively fortified, heavily funded fortress holding the line for national survival. The brutal and bountiful paradox. This frontier is a master of a deeply profound contradiction, a towering landscape that constantly lures you in with the intoxicating promise of untold riches and then actively tries to completely destroy you. You must understand that this territory demands an incredibly lethal toll from absolutely anyone bold enough to extract its wealth. Look back at the sheer devastation of the Klondike Gold Rush of 1896. 100,000 desperate people marched into the unforgiving interior, blinded by the promise of gold. Out of that massive human wave, only 30,000 actually survived the agonizing trek to reach their final destination. The rest simply starved, turned back in total defeat, or succumbed to horrific physical diseases like scurvy. The land asked for an exceptionally high price, and it was collected without mercy. Fast forward to our modern era, and you will see that the ocean is exacting that exact same brutal historical toll on the current population. Alaska currently supplies 60% of all commercial fisheries in the United States, yet this massive and vital foundational industry is actively bleeding out right before our eyes. Between the years 2022 and 2023, the highly volatile seafood sector suffered a staggering $1.8 billion catastrophic financial loss. The critical Bering Sea crab stocks completely collapsed, crashing by an unbelievable 90% in a breathtakingly short period. This sudden and violent ecological shift triggered a massive 7.6% industry job loss in a single year, aggressively pushing an entire generation of workers away from the volatile waters forever. The unpredictable ocean is completely turning against the people who rely on it for their survival. But when you look away from the dying sea and turn your full attention toward the deep interior soil, the land is doing something completely anomalous. During the peak of the summer solstice, regions like the Matanuska Valley experience a bizarre environmental phenomenon known to locals as the luminous summer. The relentless sun beats down on the earth for up to 20 hours a single day. This creates an extraordinary biological advantage where plants undergo almost continuous daylight exposure, resulting in a massive photosynthesis bonus. The vegetation absolutely explodes in sheer size. The highly nutrient-dense glacial soil, combined with this relentless solar radiation, produces crops on a scale that completely defies all conventional agricultural logic. We are talking about local farmers regularly pulling 138-pound cabbages and 2,051-pound pumpkins directly out of the dirt. The natural sugars concentrate so intensely under the endless sun that these massive crops become impossibly sweet. Standing right next to these monstrous anomalies of nature is a genuinely disorienting psychological experience. It is an agricultural anomaly so profound that it feels entirely misplaced in our modern timeline. Looking at these freakishly large harvests, you could easily imagine a strange scenario where these magnificent crops were originally cultivated by a lost race of towering giants, ancient beings gorging on the incredibly fertile earth of a forgotten era. The sheer physical scale of the harvested produce perfectly mirrors the terrifyingly exaggerated proportions of the surrounding wilderness. The state remains a place of absolute extremes, constantly balancing the devastating financial collapse of its vital ocean resources against the terrifying, oversized abundance tearing out of its rich glacial soil. It is a wild frontier that generously feeds you enormous bounties in the brief, blinding light of summer, only to relentlessly threaten your very daily existence the moment the long, dark winter returns to claim the territory. Surviving the violent Alaskan frontier, you cannot negotiate with a landscape that actively wants to destroy you. The comforting idea of official rescue in the Alaskan wilderness is largely a dangerous illusion. This territory sits aggressively upon three major grinding fault lines, making it one of the most violently seismic places on the entire planet. The historical precedent for total devastation was set in 1964, when the Great Alaska Earthquake ruptured at an incomprehensible magnitude of 9.2. That single terrifying event unleashed massive 65-foot tsunamis that literally wiped entire coastal towns completely from existence. The earth beneath this state has absolutely not stopped shaking since that day. Just recently, in December 2024, the highly volatile Aleutian Islands were violently hammered by an event known as the Adak Swarm. This relentless geological assault included two massive 6.3 magnitude earthquakes, followed immediately by over 350 destructive aftershocks. The ground simply never settles down. The federal government is now frantically funneling $66 million into Phase 1 of a project called the Shake Alert System, desperately trying to cover the most populated corridor, just to give exposed residents a few precious seconds to run before the next catastrophic seismic wave hits. But the deep earth is not the only thing trying to kill you. Here, the rapidly changing surface ice introduces a terrifying new normal of highly unpredictable devastation. As the ancient glaciers retreat, they leave behind heavily unstable, incredibly deadly coastal geography. Glacial lake outburst floods have rapidly become a horrifying annual reality. In August 2025, a massive pressurized release from Suicide Basin completely exploded, sending the violently surging Mendenhall River to an unprecedented record height of 16.65 feet, instantly drowning massive sections of the state capital. During that exact same month, a violently collapsing, unstable slope located in Tracy Arm spawned an apocalyptic 100-foot tsunami that literally swept the entire shoreline completely clean in a matter of mere seconds. When the physical earth shatters in this territory, you must understand that you are entirely on your own. Search and rescue capabilities are severely crippled by vast geographical distances and brutally unforgiving weather patterns. The highly trained Air National Guard Rescue Coordination Center is relentlessly forced to launch an average of 5 harrowing missions every single week, often flying blindly into brutal storm conditions where specialized military-grade assets are the only conceivable option for basic survival. But the everyday reality for heavily isolated rural residents is far more grim and practically staggering. A shocking 60% of all Alaskan communities do not even possess a state-registered fire department to call for assistance. Extreme isolation forcefully demands absolute self-reliance as a fundamental baseline metric for human survival. Grassroots initiatives like the newly formed Fire Gap program are currently forcing completely untrained village residents to step up and learn exactly how to fight their own raging infernos using basic backpack pumps. This absolutely desperate communal measure exists entirely because the brutal fire fatality rate in the remote bush remains a horrifying 9 times higher than anywhere else in the entire nation. Out here in the cold, waiting for an official rescue is practically a guaranteed death sentence. Self-reliance is law. The reclaiming of indigenous lands. To truly comprehend who rightfully holds power over this treacherous and vital territory, we must examine a landmark legal maneuver that completely bypassed the traditional reservation system utilized throughout the lower 48 states. In 1971, the federal government enacted the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, a massive legislative mandate completely restructuring the fundamental ownership of the frontier. Instead of corralling indigenous populations onto isolated tracts of federal land, this unprecedented agreement carved out 12 massive regional corporations and over 200 distinct village corporations. It was a structural shift that transformed ancient tribes into modern corporate entities overnight, fundamentally altering the dynamic between the original inhabitants and the encroaching modern world. The sheer scale of this massive land transfer remains staggering to consider today. The historic settlement officially transferred 44 million acres of ancestral territory directly back to native shareholders, accompanied by $962.5 million in crucial financial compensation. This process of returning the earth to its original stewards is an ongoing, incredibly complex bureaucratic saga that continues to unfold right in front of us. Just recently, in April 2026, the Bureau of Land Management officially finalized the conveyance of 1,085 critical acres situated near the remote settlement of Flat directly to Doyon Limited. That specific transfer pushed the total conveyed historical entitlement past the 97% mark, establishing a massive geographical foundation for long-term economic planning and vital cultural preservation across the enormous state. However, when you closely examine the fine print of these celebrated government transfers, a deeply troubling and sinister reality immediately emerges from the freezing dirt. The federal government did indeed hand back millions of acres of ancestral lands, but they returned territories heavily poisoned by decades of gross federal and industrial negligence. Countless parcels of this newly returned land were heavily laced with toxic lead, dangerous PCBs, and massive volumes of abandoned petroleum waste. The government essentially returned a poisoned chalice to the indigenous populations. Entire tracts of sacred terrain were rendered incredibly dangerous by the very military and industrial forces that originally seized them. Now, the EPA is frantically scrambling to initiate a massive, highly complex program to systematically investigate and remediate these severely contaminated corporate lands. This immense cleanup effort requires deep, ongoing consultation with tribal governments, simply to ensure that the delicate remediation process does not further desecrate the surviving sacred sites and ancient traditional places that these tight communities are desperately trying to protect and restore. The original Alaskans are absolutely not sitting idly by waiting on federal saviors to clean up the toxic mess or dictate their future. They are aggressively reclaiming their sovereign resilience and completely rewriting the modern economic playbook on their own terms. Modern native corporations are increasingly pivoting away from destructive resource extraction and moving entirely towards sustainable, deeply value-based regional development. Consider the profound actions of Alaska, the major corporation representing the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people in the southeastern region. They recently launched the groundbreaking Seacoast Trust, a massive $100 million financial vehicle designed specifically to support fundamental community priorities. Rather than catering to outside corporate interests, this immense fund focuses heavily on crucial projects guided strictly by local and traditional native values. They are actively funding critical salmon predation studies to save the collapsing local fisheries, building crucially needed affordable housing in highly remote coastal villages like Yakutat, and heavily financing traditional language revitalization programs to ensure their ancient cultures survive the coming modern era. They are decisively proving that the true power in this unforgiving state no longer rests entirely in the hands of distant federal bureaucrats or hungry outside mining conglomerates. Alaska remains a magnificent land of profound, grinding contradictions. It stands as the absolute primary military shield for American national defense, yet its own foundational infrastructure is actively sinking into the rapidly thawing permafrost beneath its feet. It is a wildly paradoxical place, capable of producing record-breaking agricultural abundance during the blinding summer, while simultaneously witnessing the catastrophic, devastating collapse of its vital commercial fisheries in the volatile oceans. As the global climate continues to shift aggressively and the geopolitical importance of the entire Arctic region grows exponentially every single year, the extraordinarily high price of merely existing in this extreme environment will only continue to rise. Overcoming these mounting modern challenges will demand a level of raw, local ingenuity and relentless human endurance practically unprecedented in the long history of the state. This territory is fundamentally unforgiving, constantly testing the absolute limits of physical strength and the sheer collective willpower of every single resident. The ultimate survival of this profoundly strategic, rapidly crumbling frontier rests firmly in the highly capable hands of its original architects, the resilient people who have successfully navigated its brutal extremes for tens of thousands of years entirely alone.